The Romans and the Jews, a podcast by Dr. Arpaio. We began our consideration of historical case studies with the island of Elephantine, and then with the Hellenistic city of Alexandria, in two periods that were approximately 500 years apart. The Jewish community of Elephantine was located in an Egypt that had been recently conquered by the Persian king Cyrus the Great, and which then belonged to the Persian Empire from 550 to 330 BCE. The Jewish community of Alexandria was situated in a city that had been founded by Alexander the Great around 330 BCE after his conquest of the Persian Empire. By the 5th century CE, when we examined the Jewish community of Alexandria, the city had been conquered anew by the Romans under Julius Caesar and had been incorporated into the Roman Empire. In this podcast, we will turn next to a deeper examination of ancient Rome and the special role it played in the history of antisemitism. But before we go any farther, let me explain what scholars mean by historical terms like ancient Rome, the Roman Republic, the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire. And no, I did not make a mistake and repeat myself. Please note the difference in capitalization. The difference changes the historical meaning of the terms. Let me explain. When we use the term Rome today, it normally refers to the modern city of Rome, located in Italy, a relatively young country, younger, for instance, than the United States. Italy was created in 1861. Rome became the capital of Italy in 1870 and retains that status today. Instead, when we put the adjective ancient before the word Rome, we signify a very different place from the modern city of Rome. Ancient Rome began as a small state around 5000 BCE and grew to become the largest state in the Mediterranean basin by the 1st century BCE. It lasted to the mid-5th century CE, when it collapsed in the western Mediterranean basin, but still persisted in the eastern Mediterranean, and was called the Byzantine Empire by more recent scholars, even though the Byzantine emperors considered themselves Roman emperors. Today, scholars distinguish between ancient and modern Rome because neither the ancient state nor the people are the same as the modern city of Rome or the modern Romans who live in the city. Indeed, with relatively few exceptions, the inhabitants of modern Rome today are not the descendants of the ancient Romans, any more than the people of Indiana, Pennsylvania today are the descendants of the original people living in our town in ancient times. Although some writers capitalize the adjective ancient, I prefer that you do not, unless the word is located at the beginning of a sentence, of course. Let me also point out that I will normally use the adjective ancient at the beginning of a discussion about ancient Rome, and, like other scholars, I may drop the adjective ancient and use the shorthand Rome and Romans instead of repeating the word ancient over and over again. Now that we understand our historical terms and their usage, let's consider a brief historical outline of ancient Rome. Rome was founded sometime in the 8th century BCE as a monarchy, led by a king and a small group of elites. As Rome expanded, the number of elites grew and overthrew the monarchy and created a republic. We refer to ancient Rome at this time as the Roman Republic, both words capitalized. Like the monarchy before it, the republic was dominated by elites. Power shifted from the monarchy to a pre-existing political body called the Senate, a term the Roman Republic invented and which we borrowed in the United States thousands of years later for our upper house of Congress. The Roman Republic was very successful. It spread throughout the Italian peninsula, into the western Mediterranean, north into Europe, and into the eastern Mediterranean. As the Roman Republic grew beyond the Italian peninsula, we use the term empire to describe it. Notice the small letter E. The word empire in English comes from Latin, the language of the ancient Romans. In this context, and spelled with a small letter E, the word signifies an extensive group of varied territories under a single supreme authority. Although Rome slowly acquired an empire, we still use the term the Roman Republic to describe it because it was still a republic politically, meaning that the Roman Senate was still considered to be the supreme political authority in the empire. The term Roman Empire has a second meaning when it is written with a capital E. It signifies a new type of state that emerged out of a series of civil wars that lasted for most of the 1st century BCE. Unable to withstand the instability caused by political strife or unrest, the Roman Republic died, and a new form of government called the Roman Empire slowly came into being at the end of the 1st century BCE. While republican institutions like the Roman Senate persisted under the empire, it lost most of its power, and in its place arose a single person to lead the state. That person was Augustus Caesar, who invented the new word emperor as his new title. We still use the term emperor or empress. That is the female form of the word. An emperor is a one-person ruler of great power and rank, higher than a king or queen, who rules over a state called an empire. Thus, we capitalize the E in Roman Empire to signify that we are writing about an extensive group of varied territories under the single supreme authority of an emperor. So let's review. We use the term the Roman Republic to signify Rome before the Civil War, and the term the Roman Empire to signify Rome after the Civil War. Under the Republic, we do not capitalize the word empire because we mean an extensive group of varied territories under a single supreme authority, in the case of ancient Rome, a senate. Under the empire, we always capitalize the word empire because we mean a form of government run by a man or woman with greater power and rank than a king or queen, in the case of ancient Rome, an emperor. Next, let's turn our attention to the historical encounter of the Romans and the Jews in the 1st century BCE. Roman expansion into the eastern Mediterranean began during the civil wars that brought an end to the Roman Republic and gave birth to the Roman Empire. Not satisfied with Egypt, Rome set its sights on other kingdoms further east, including the Kingdom of Judea. The Kingdom of Judea was going through its own civil war during this period, and one of the contenders for the throne of Judea was named Herod, a young man who had yet to earn the epithet, the Great. Herod belonged to the Jewish elite and was a contender for the throne in the Judean Civil War. Although he claimed that the throne of the kingdom belonged to him, he had little hope of winning. As he looked around for allies, he noticed how the Romans had consolidated their control over Egypt and were looking to expand in the Mediterranean. So, Herod decided to strike a deal with the Roman Senate. In exchange for Senate backing, Herod agreed to make Judea a client state in Rome's growing empire. A client state is a state that has a degree of autonomy, but is under the authority of another, more powerful state. In this case, Judea was nominally run by Herod and the Jewish elite, but the king of Judea would have to remain loyal to the Senate, and once the Roman Republic became the Roman Empire, the king would have to remain loyal to the emperor. Additionally, Herod allowed the mighty Roman army to occupy Judea, ostensibly to help Herod protect and enlarge his kingdom, and Herod allowed Rome to introduce a Roman administration into Judea to integrate the kingdom into the Roman Empire. Finally, Herod agreed that, as with the practice in other territories occupied by Rome, his Jewish subjects would pay annual taxes to support the Roman troops that ostensibly protected Judea, and the Roman administration which introduced Roman infrastructure in the form of new roads, aqueducts, public buildings, and the like. In return, the Roman Senate threw its army in support of Herod, and, having helped him win the civil war, declared him king of Judea. During his 33-year reign, Herod enlarged the kingdom of Judea, thus earning the epithet the Great. Credit for his success, however, was owing to his kingdom's special status as a Roman client state. Herod could count on the Roman army to defeat his enemies, to protect his throne, and to quell revolts against him among his fellow Jews. In agreeing to make his kingdom a client state, Herod also asked the Senate to grant a privilege to the Jews that Rome would never infringe on Jewish religious practices or beliefs. The Roman Senate easily granted this privilege because they normally did not care about the religious practices of the people in the empire. Unforeseen by Herod and the Senate, potential sources of conflict existed between the Romans and the Jews because of fundamental differences in Roman and Jewish ways of life, each of which was based, in turn, on fundamentally different forms of identity. Whether they were Hellenized or not, Jews in the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE structured their daily lives according to their interpretations of the Law of Moses. For instance, the Ten Commandments, a compendium of essential Israelite beliefs, were categorical about not worshipping other gods. The first commandment stated, "You shall have no other gods to rival me." The second, "You shall not make yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything in heaven above, or on earth beneath, or in the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them." The Romans, in contrast, had many gods, and most Romans found the Jewish conception of the divine to be very puzzling. Still, the Senate granted Herod the safeguards he requested for the Jews to follow their own religious practices and beliefs without Roman interference, whether the Jews were Roman citizens or not. You will recall from our previous podcast that Augustus, Rome's first emperor, created an imperial cult. He encouraged loyalty to himself in his new role as emperor by encouraging Roman citizens to worship his ancestors as gods. By engaging in this practice, Romans showed publicly that they accepted Augustus as a man, descended from the gods, and the rightful ruler over Rome. Augustus held lavish celebrations during which citizens were invited to burn incense in local temples dedicated to his ancestors, including Julius Caesar, who, you will recall, had recently been assassinated. Members of the Roman elite classes, eager to gain Augustus's approval, additionally worshipped him as a living god alongside his ancestors. After Augustus's death, the imperial cult spread among a Roman citizenry eager to please the new Roman emperor. Augustus and his successors encouraged this practice by constructing Roman temples dedicated to the imperial cult throughout the immense Roman Empire. Some later emperors insisted that everyone in the empire, both citizens and non, worship them in public acts of loyalty during annual festivities in honor of the ruling emperor. Anyone refusing to worship the emperor risked capital punishment. The festivals celebrating the emperor's divine nature included lots of free entertaining, including free food and drink, chariot races, gladiators fighting to the death, reenactment of Roman victories in which slave reenactors really fought to the death, and even orgies with free male and female prostitutes. Obviously, Jews could not participate in these religious rituals, no matter how appealing they must have been to Gentiles, without giving up their Jewish identity. You will recall that shortly after becoming emperor, Caligula demanded that everyone worship him as a living god. Flaccus, the governor of Alexandria, eager to win the new emperor's favor and to keep his position, rushed to enforce the edict. In doing so, he provoked a revolt among the Jewish population and violence between warring factions of Alexandrian Greeks and Jews. Only Caligula's assassination prevented the revolt from spreading to Judea, because Claudius, Caligula's successor, exempted Jews once again from the requirement of participating in the imperial cult. Still, there was always the possibility that a future emperor could make the imperial cult mandatory for everyone and rescind the exemption for the Jews. And, as we shall see, this is exactly what happened. Now, you might be wondering how the Roman state could alter its pact with the kingdom of Judea. From the Roman point of view, since the Senate had made Herod king of Judea, the Roman state had the right to pick Herod's successor. Furthermore, since the kingdom of Judea was a client state, the Roman state had total authority over Judea. And finally, since the Roman state had given Jews the privilege to be left alone to practice their religion, the Roman state could also take that privilege away. If the Jews did not obey, the emperor could send the Roman army to enforce his will, and the Jewish army was no match for it. As you might have guessed by now, not all the Jews were happy with Herod the Great's decision to make the kingdom of Judea a Roman client state. Many Jews grew unhappy with having the Romans living among them. They did not like paying taxes to Rome, which paid for the occupation, and forced Jews to follow Roman law, which many Jews believed were in violation of their one true God's laws. Still other Jews accused Herod of violating Mosaic law to ingratiate himself to his Roman allies. For instance, as a Hellenized Jew, Herod assimilated to a Roman way of life just like other elites in the peripheries of the Roman Empire. For some Jews, Herod seemed more Roman than Jewish. If Herod were living today, we might think of him as a good politician. He knew how to gain the support of the Jewish elite and subordinate classes on the one hand, and the Roman elite on the other. One solution was a much-needed renovation of the Second Temple. In one sense, these efforts were necessary because the temple was in much need of repairs after many years of neglect. But Herod had ulterior motives. He wanted to make Jerusalem an important city in the Roman Empire by renovating the temple in a Hellenistic architectural style to attract Roman tourists to the city. He also wanted to make it appear to Jews that he had made the kingdom of Judea great again. And finally, Herod meant the beautification and expansion of the temple to make Romans and Jews admire him as both a Roman and Jewish leader. The temple indeed became one of the wonders of the ancient world. Non-Jews from around the Roman Empire came to visit it. Since non-Jews had never been allowed inside the temple, Herod had a section built for non-Jews on the temple grounds. Jewish worshippers appreciated the lengths to which Herod had gone to give temple worship a greater sense of dignity and spirituality than it had before. Thus, the temple remained a place of worship, but it also became a stage on which Jews could imagine that their tiny kingdom in the immense Roman Empire was powerful, and that Jews still mattered among all the people in the world as their God's chosen people, just as their religion said they did. Despite Herod's best efforts, his Jewish subjects remained divided about him. Furthermore, Jews were not a religiously homogeneous group. Like other religions, Judaism was, and still is, subdivided into sects. The term sect designates a subgroup of any given religion when groups of believers differ in non-essential beliefs or in how they practice their religion. For instance, we can think of Presbyterians, Baptists, Episcopalians, and Roman Catholics as different sects of Christianity. Or, to use a Muslim example, Shiites and Sunnis are two sects of Islam. Let's consider three of the most important Jewish sects for our history of antisemitism around the 1st century BCE to the 1st century CE. The first sect was the Sadducees. The second the Pharisees, and the third, the Essenes. The Sadducees differed from the other two sects by their primary emphasis on the temple and temple worship. They believed that to be fully Jewish, one had to engage in the temple practices enumerated in the Bible, so both the temple and Jewish priests were essential to Judaism. As you might have guessed, the leaders of the Sadducees included many of the priests at the temple, including the high priest, rabbis, or religious teachers, and many followers among the elite and subordinate classes, especially in Judea and the city of Jerusalem, including members of the Sanhedrin, the chief religious court. You could think of it as sort of an ancient Jewish Supreme Court. Herod realized that the Sadducees were an important group to have on his side. His lavish spending on the temple structures, their upkeep, and the financial support for the temple priests earned him the Sadducees' loyalty. The Sadducees supported Herod for another important reason. They thought that their king's friendship with Rome was the safest policy for the kingdom of Judea. If Judea found itself at war with Rome, the Second Temple might be damaged or destroyed, and, for the Sadducees, Judaism without the temple was unthinkable. So, even after Herod the Great's death, and even as the Roman presence in Judea grew in intensity, the Sadducees argued for strong and close ties with the Roman Empire. The Pharisees constituted a rival sect to the Sadducees. While the Pharisees piously engaged in Jewish practices associated with the temple, as all Jews did at that time, the Pharisees rejected the Sadducees' insistence that temple worship was the most perfect form of Jewish worship. Instead, the Pharisees focused on absolute obedience to the God of Abraham's laws, and they believed that the only way to be a Jew was by knowing, understanding, and following the laws of Moses. Indeed, the Pharisees focused on absolute obedience to the God of Abraham's laws, and they believed that the only way to be a Jew, a true Jew, was by knowing, understanding, and following the laws of Moses. The Pharisees prided themselves on what they thought were the primary duties of a Jew: knowing important passages of the Torah by heart, reading and debating the Mosaic law in local prayer halls called synagogues, and seeking a deeper understanding of their God's will for mankind through textual analysis. The Pharisees were so concerned with being in an exact obedience of what they thought the Bible said that their critics accused them of ignoring the intent of the 600-plus laws in their effort to do exactly what the words of the law spelled out. The Pharisees counted among their leaders many rabbis, scribes, and some priests. Let me say a word about the scribes. They were vitally important to Judaism until the invention of the printing press in the 16th century. Scribes were a group of professionals whose only task in life was to make copies of Jewish sacred texts, which were done by hand. Scribes had to copy the text absolutely perfectly because even a single mistake would mean that they would no longer be able to follow their God's laws as had been transmitted to them by their God. Like the Sadducees, the Pharisees were represented on the Sanhedrin, but they had a much larger following among the Jewish population because of their close contact with Jews from every walk of life in synagogues, and because of their emphasis on orthodoxy, or strict obedience to accepted religious views, which earned them great respect across Judean society. The Pharisees were wary of the religious consequences of their king's alliance with Rome, but they were also wary of what a clean break with Rome might mean. The Pharisees were more critical of Herod than the Sadducees, owing to his introduction of Hellenistic and Roman culture into Judea. But they still supported Herod and his allies. After all, the king courted their favor despite their criticisms because the Pharisees had the largest following among the Jews. Moreover, the Pharisees believed that Rome was in Judea for the long run, Therefore, the Jews had to find a way both to observe the Mosaic law and to accommodate the Romans. The Essenes constituted a third Jewish sect we will consider. They might be thought of as a highly organized countercultural group. It's certainly not an exact way to define them, but the approximation works for our purpose because the Essenes worshipped at the temple and attended prayer services at synagogues like the followers of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. However, the Essenes saw themselves as opponents of both sects. They believed that to be truly Jewish, one had to be committed to expelling all non-believers from the Promised Land. And because the Essenes were certain that Jewish society was sinning against the one true God by permitting non-Jews to live in their midst, they believed that any Jew who collaborated with the Romans, including Herod, were no longer practicing Jews. For the Essenes, Herod and his allies had lost their right to call themselves Jews. The Essenes were also willing to go to war with Rome, even though they recognized that the Romans were militarily more powerful than the Jews. But they counted on their God intervening in human history to make them accomplish the seemingly impossible, to defeat the Romans. The Essenes' leaders were mostly rabbis and scribes. The Essenes were a much smaller sect than the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Essenes were also more likely to hold messianic beliefs. They thought that they could count on a Messiah, a specially anointed leader, who their one true God would choose to lead them in battle and to create a new godly kingdom. Key to the Messiah's leadership qualities were his supposed special powers, including the power to perform miracles and to resurrect himself from the dead. Although many contemporaries shared the Essenes' belief in the coming of a Messiah, it is important to emphasize that a belief in the coming of a Messiah did not make one an adherent of the Essenes. Rather, the Messianic tradition was an important part of the Jewish Weltanschauung in the first 2 centuries CE. Toward the end of Herod the Great's reign, there was no single expectation about who the God of Abraham might send to save the Jewish people from their current predicament. Some thought the Messiah might be one of Herod the Great's children. Others thought that a Messiah would have to be someone else, but definitely from the royal house of David. According to tradition, to be a legitimate king of the Jews, the king had to be a descendant of King David, the Israelites' most famous monarch who had reigned over 1,000 years ago. If there was no agreement about where the Messiah would come from, there was also no agreement about what type of leader he might be. Some thought that the Messiah would overthrow King Herod the Great, or his heirs, and become king himself. Others thought the Messiah would have to be a warrior, because the Jews would have to defeat the Romans if they wanted to expel them from Judea. A different line of thinking was that the Roman occupation was a divine punishment, so the coming Messiah would have to be a prophet. Only a man specially chosen by the one true God could explain to them their sins and how to atone for them. Only then would the Messiah create a true kingdom of God. Many Jews could not make up their mind, and the more the Jews looked for answers, the more anxious they became. Anxiety, in turn, contributed to the further spread of messianic expectations, just as relations between the Romans and the Jews began to spiral out of control in the 1st century CE. Since growing Jewish discontent appeared aimed at some form of civil unrest, we should consider how the Romans dealt with rebellions, so we can understand what the Jews could have expected if they rebelled. Rome ruled over a vast territorial empire as a republic and as an empire. Roman society was complex, so I'll have to simplify my description of it. Rome had a small elite made of Roman citizens who varied widely in their wealth and status. By the 1st century BCE, a large part of the citizenry came from people who had originated on the Italian peninsula and traced their origins back to the early days of the Roman Republic. In subsequent centuries, people in the Western Mediterranean attained citizenry when the areas where they lived were incorporated into the Roman Empire. Newer citizens came from areas in the Eastern Mediterranean. Allied with the citizens was a much larger group of non-citizens, whose ancestors came from the same areas that had been conquered by the Roman army, or whose rulers had made deals with Rome, like Herod the Great. Although the more powerful non-citizens varied widely in wealth and status, they all collaborated with the Roman state and allied themselves to the Roman citizenry. This subgroup looked for opportunities to become Roman citizens themselves, and when they succeeded, they enlarged the number of Roman citizens. By contrast, the vast majority of non-citizens were less powerful and ranged from wealthy to extremely poor. The rest of society consisted of slaves. Like other ancient societies, the Romans had a large slave population. Depending on where one lived and the circumstances under which a person became a slave, slavery was not necessarily a permanent condition, nor were the children of slaves automatically slaves. Still, slaves and children of slaves were at the bottom of Roman society. Given this complex society and the enormous extent of an empire that spanned 3 continents, the Roman elites and the state's greatest fear was unrest, which could come in several forms. Civil and political unrest among its citizens endangered the empire, as the civil wars had clearly demonstrated. Revolts by non-citizens was also a danger. If a province rose up in revolt, the Romans feared that it might spread to other provinces. Even if it didn't, it cost lots of money to put down revolts, and increased spending to squash revolts would mean raising taxes, which then could foment further revolts. Slave rebellions were also a constant threat. Some of them became so serious that the Romans were forced to send its soldiers to do battle with large armies of rebellious slaves. Slave rebellions were also costly, and the cost of putting them down meant increasing taxes, which could then foment revolt among the non-citizens. Clearly, slave rebellions were a threat to Rome's very existence. Rome's solution to these threats will seem drastic to us today. The Roman state made examples of the culprits and sometimes extended harsh punishments to all those involved in unrest. Citizens found guilty of rebellion were beheaded. Non-citizens or slaves were crucified. Death by crucifixion was a horrible torture. A victim was tied to a cross, or sometimes nailed to it, and left to hang from it until he died. Crucifixion was meant to be both a spectacle of death and a symbol of the consequences for non-citizens if they challenged Roman authority. Large crosses for crucifixion were typically located outside Roman urban spaces on hills, along the principal roads leading to and from the gates of a city, town, or village. Their location was meant as both a spectacle of death and a symbol of Roman authority for the inhabitants of the urban center and anyone entering or leaving it. Even when the crosses stood empty, they maintained their powerful symbolism. The Romans were also known for carrying out other extreme forms of punishment against non-citizens. For instance, the Romans sometimes forced an entire society into exile and forbade them to return home. Other times, the Romans put to death or maimed all the men and sold the women and children into slavery. The point to Roman cruelty was that it sent a message to everyone in the empire, citizens, non-citizens, and slaves, that the Roman state would not tolerate unrest. Most Romans, and especially the Roman officials in Judea, thought that the Jewish religion was hogwash. They did not believe in the existence of the Jewish God any more than they believed in a Jewish Messiah. From their perspective, the Messianic tradition fell under a possible threat to Roman law and order. If a Messianic movement did not challenge Roman authority, it would probably be ignored. If instead a Messiah disturbed the peace or otherwise challenged Roman authority, the Messiah would be crucified and his movement crushed. And, as in other areas in the empire, Roman officials in Judea might hold all of society responsible. The Jewish elite's awareness of the Roman state's methods made them keep a lid on the Messianic tradition. The Roman state rewarded them too well with wealth, power, and prestige to risk anything by supporting a Messiah. To understand how slim were Jewish chances of success in a revolt against Rome, we need to consider the relative strength of the Roman and Judean armies. Rome's forces were overwhelming. As part of the original agreement with Rome, Herod allowed the Roman state to garrison 2 of its 60 legions in Judea. Although the size of the Roman legion changed over time, in the 1st century CE, a legion had approximately 5,000 professional soldiers plus additional support troops. These troops obeyed Roman military leaders, eventually called procurators, who were chosen specifically to oversee Roman troops in Judea. If the 2 legions were forced to withdraw or were beaten, the Roman state could call on imperial troops garrisoned in neighboring Syria and Alexandria, and conceivably the remaining 58 legions, numbering approximately 300,000 of the best-trained soldiers in the Mediterranean basin, to crush a Judean revolt. Historians have no way of knowing the exact number of Judean troops in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. This fact in itself suggests that the Judean army was neither as well organized nor as large as the 60 legions the Roman state had at its disposal. Nor were Judean soldiers as well seasoned as Roman legionaries. And yet, the Judean army, together with the several hundred-man guard that policed the temple, probably outnumbered the 2 Roman legions stationed in Judea. Added to these Jewish forces were civilian auxiliaries, who might join with the Judean army against the Romans. But even if Judean forces in the 1st or 2nd century CE were able to win an initial victory against the Roman army, the Roman state would respond by sending an overwhelming army to crush the rebellion. When Herod died in 4 BCE, Augustus Caesar was still emperor. Augustus died 18 years after Herod. After consulting with his procurators in Judea and the Senate in Rome, Augustus decided to keep the throne vacant rather than immediately choose one of Herod's 16 children. The leading contenders for the throne, from a Roman perspective, were 3 of Herod's sons who had been educated as Hellenized Roman citizens, alongside Augustus's own children in the city of Rome. Caesar was uncertain which of them was capable of running Judea the way he wanted it run. So, he gave his procurators greater control over Judea and divided Herod's kingdom into 4 regions called tetrarchies. A tetrarchy was simply a quarter of the kingdom of Judea when Herod died. Augustus gave each of the 3 sons the title of tetrarch, which simply meant a ruler of at least a quarter of Herod's old kingdom. By calling the son tetrarchs, Augustus avoided having to decide immediately which son should be king. Because they were tetrarchs rather than king of Judea, Augustus justified making the 3 sons totally dependent on Rome. Thus, Augustus dangled the chance of becoming Herod's successor over the heads of the 3 sons. Only the one who proved he was the most loyal and capable of the 3 could hope to be made king. This solution proved an ingenious way for Rome to maintain its hold over Judea and to assure that only the most capable of the 3 sons would take the father's place. The 3 heirs whom the Romans thought were trustworthy were Archelaus, Philip, who you do not need to really remember because he's not important to our story, and Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas, of course, was a different person from his father, Herod the Great. Rome's assignments of the tetrarchies to the 3 sons responded to Roman needs. Archelaus received the 2 tetrarchies of Judea and Samaria. Judea was the most prestigious and important of the 4 regions because it contained the city of Jerusalem and the temple. The appointment made Archelaus the most important of the 3 tetrarchs. Augustus gave Herod Antipas the tetrarchy of Galilee and some land on the left bank of the Jordan River that had not been incorporated into Herod the Great's kingdom at the time of his death, but which Augustus thought should be assigned to Herod Antipas. Of course, the people of Judea had not been consulted about these decisions, and frankly, Most were not very satisfied. They had never heard of tetrarchs or tetrarchies, and they did not like how their kingdom was falling increasingly under direct Roman control. Still, many expected the Romans to appoint a king of Judea. Others thought more provocatively in terms of who should be the king of the Jews, meaning who should be king regardless of what the Romans wanted. Still others thought it was time to look for a Messiah, meaning that they wanted the God of Abraham to send them a specially anointed superhero to free the chosen people from the Romans. Archelaus had every advantage as a favorite son of Herod the Great before becoming tetrarch of Judea and Samaria at the age of 20. He received a Hellenized education in the city of Rome, which meant that he had been given access to the greatest knowledge available to people living in the Roman Empire at that time. Unfortunately, Archelaus had not put much into learning as a young man, so, despite his educational pedigree, he had the makings of a poor leader. Archelaus assumed his post as tetrarch just before the Jewish feast of the Passover in 4 BCE. The Feast of Passover, as you hopefully remember, was, and still is, one of the most important religious moments in the Jewish calendar. It commemorates the Exodus myth, in which the mythical prophet Moses supposedly led the Israelites out of slavery. Although there is no historical evidence for the Exodus story, and although the holiday has important religious significance, Passover also carries great political significance. It marks the point in the Exodus myth when the God of Abraham supposedly struck down every firstborn male animal, including humans, in Egypt, thus provoking Pharaoh to let the Israelites escape slavery. The holiday conveys a message about how the God of Abraham wrote human history through its chosen people, and how their God took them from slavery in Egypt and gave them an area of the eastern Mediterranean as their promised land. One final point should be made about Passover. Although the ancient Israelites had not yet invented the Messianic tradition, for Jews living in 4 BCE, Moses could appear as a mythical figure in the Messianic tradition and a powerful image that stirred up anti-Roman sentiment, and it did. Goldstein does an excellent job in narrating events, so make sure you read and understand what happened and why Archelaus was removed as tetrarch. Herod Antipas, Archelaus's younger brother, fared much better as tetrarch. He styled himself as the sole heir worthy of becoming king of Judea. He dropped his second name Antipas to identify himself more closely with his father. He styled himself as a king when he interacted with the Jewish population, even though he had not yet been appointed to the position by the Romans. He even wanted to make it seem to his fellow Jews that he might be a Messiah, but one that would not challenge Roman authority. As for the Roman authorities, according to the Roman state, the title King of Judea was no longer in use, so the procurators in Judea, Samaria, and Syria either pretended not to take notice of Herod Antipas's use of the title, or they saw his use of it as an expediency for pacifying the Jews. For Roman officials, so long as the Jews did not revolt, who cared if Herod Antipas used the title of king with his fellow Jews? Herod Antipas's aspirations explain why he strengthened ties to Rome. He suppressed minor revolts in Galilee and built Roman-style cities. He dedicated them to Caesar Augustus, Tiberius, the emperor after Augustus, and members of their families. These cities included Roman temples, even though most Jews saw the presence of Roman temples in Galilee as an insult to their God and to them. But Herod Antipas did not build these cities to please the Jewish population. He built them to please the Roman authorities and the emperor. These efforts to transform the landscape were part of a policy of Romanization, the cultural, political, and social transformation of an area so that it looked like it had always been a part of Rome. With the death of Tiberius in 37 CE, Caligula became emperor. Herod Antipas's nephew, Herod Agrippa, also wanted his uncle's position. So he accused Herod Antipas of disloyalty, or treason, against Caligula. The new emperor did not know or like Herod Antipas, so he removed him as tetrarch and gave the title to Herod Agrippa. Herod Agrippa was an effective political leader. He backed Claudius's claim to the Roman imperial title after the murder of Caligula, so when Claudius became emperor, Herod Agrippa found himself in an enviable position. Claudius granted Agrippa the title of King of Judea, which Herod Agrippa held from 41 to 44 CE. To succeed as king, he maintained close ties to the Romans, and to Claudius in particular. He also cultivated ties to the Sadducees and the Pharisees, who, you will recall, favored or at least tolerated good relations with Rome. In contrast, Herod Agrippa persecuted the Essenes because they opposed him as a religious traitor and because they advocated the violent expulsion of the Romans from Judea. Herod Agrippa also persecuted the Jewish followers of Jesus because the Sadducees and the Pharisees believed that the followers of Jesus were heretical or no longer Jewish. When Herod Agrippa died in 44 CE, his son was still a child, so the kingdom of Judea disappeared and control of the area returned to the Roman procurators. For the next 22 years, running up to the Great Rebellion of 66 CE, Rome faced several minor Jewish rebellions, which Goldstein narrates. Be sure to read that section carefully, too. By 66 CE, most Jews viewed the Romans as enemies. The rebellion was sparked when the Roman procurator of Judea, named Phyllis, responded to a public insult by ordering his soldiers to murder everyone in a neighborhood in the city of Jerusalem. The city and the surrounding territories exploded in revolt and soon spread throughout the Tetrarchy of Judea. Although the rebellion did not spread beyond Judea, it was still called the Great Rebellion because it ended with the conquest of the city of Jerusalem in 70 CE. The Romans destroyed much of the city, including the Second Temple, which the general Titus, the emperor's brother, ordered demolished. It was never rebuilt. The destruction of the temple had an enormous transformative impact on Jewish practices. Without the temple, Jerusalem, or Jewish autonomy in Judea, Jews could no longer sacrifice animals to their God. Moreover, the chaotic conditions created by the Jewish wars made other types of sacrifices in local prayer houses increasingly difficult. Under these conditions, sacrificial offerings slowly lost their importance in Jewish practices. The loss of the temple was most consequential for the Sadducees. Their sect declined and eventually died out because Jewish priests had lost their central role in Jewish life. Without the temple, priests were no longer required in religious functions. The almost constant state of war with Rome had a disastrous impact on the Essenes. As Jewish community after community fell to the Roman army, the Essenes either joined the other Jewish sects or were killed in battle. In contrast to the Sadducees and the Essenes, the Pharisees grew in number and importance. Without the temple, their role as rabbis increased and became central to Jewish life. Another sect of Jews, led by rabbis who did not belong to the Pharisees, also increased in number and importance. These rabbis were the followers of Jesus, whom the Romans had put to death as a rabble-rouser approximately 40 years before the destruction of the temple. You see here a chart that displays the three major Jewish sects in the years leading up to the destruction of the temple, plus a fourth, the followers of Jesus. I'll talk about them in the next podcast, and you will read about them in the next chapter in Goldstein. Three of the groups survived the Great Rebellion. The Pharisees and their followers followed what was called Pharisaic Judaism. Their group consisted of Jews who followed the rabbis who had called themselves Pharisees before the Great Rebellion. After the year 66 CE, The Pharisees revised their religious texts and Jewish practices to cope with the new conditions. So scholars like Goldstein call them Pharisaic Jews, and their beliefs Pharisaic Judaism. The Essenes found themselves in an increasingly untenable situation. Each time the Romans defeated a rebel Jewish city or enclave, they wiped out the Essenes. The Essenes would continue fighting the Romans for a few more decades after the Great Rebellion, but eventually the Romans wiped them out. The followers of Jesus increasingly differentiated themselves from other Jews after the Great Rebellion. Still, they considered themselves Jews, which is why scholars refer to them as Jesus-centered Jews and their beliefs as Jesus-centered Judaism. The Sadducees and their followers, in contrast, disappeared. Most embraced Pharisaic Judaism. A few joined the other surviving Jewish sects. The Romans were proud of their victory over the Jewish rebels, and they erected a triumphal arch to celebrate it. The arch still stands today in the modern city of Rome. Among other images of the rebellion, the arch depicts religious objects from the temple that were paraded through the streets of the city of Rome to celebrate the victory. The Great Rebellion had enormous consequences for the history of humanity all the way to the present day. After the suppression of the revolt, Rome established complete control over all 4 tetrarchies, even the ones that had not joined the rebellion. Of course, the most important tetrarchy was in Judea, which, you will recall, had been the center of Jewish political and religious life for over 1,000 years. The Romans rebuilt the city of Jerusalem, but they did not allow the Jews to rebuild their temple. All Jews were banned from moving back to the city eventually, except for ones with Roman citizenship. To make matters worse, the Romans also began expelling Jews from the whole tetrarchy of Judea as a punishment for the rebellion, even if the Jews had not rebelled. This expulsion is called the diaspora. Rebellions against Romans continued sporadically in other tetrarchies and in Jewish communities in the eastern Mediterranean for the next 70 years. The Roman army inevitably crushed them and prohibited them from returning. Jewish communities had already begun to spring up within the Roman Empire before the diaspora in cities like Antioch, Damascus, Alexandria, and even Rome. In contrast to the Jews of the diaspora, these pre-diaspora Jews had voluntarily left the kingdom of Judea and returned home from time to time. The diaspora changed all that. Jews could not return to the Promised Land, even for a visit. The kingdom of Judea no longer existed. Their friends and relatives no longer lived there. Their homes had been confiscated or destroyed, and the temple had been demolished. While we might be tempted to think of the diaspora as a precise date, it was more akin to a process. The complete expulsion of Jews from their homeland happened slowly in fits and starts. Perceived Roman mistreatment in areas in the former kingdom of Judea might provoke a rebellion against Rome. Maybe not all of the Jews in the area joined in the rebellion. Certainly some, like the very old and the very young, would not have taken up arms against the Roman army. As the Roman army put down a rebellion, it crucified culprits and expelled the whole Jewish community from the area, with the exception of those very few Jews who were Roman citizens. The expelled Jews could not settle anywhere where Jews had already been banned from living because of previous revolts against Rome. For Jewish communities that had lived for over 1,000 years in the Promised Land, the diaspora was a traumatic event. The Romans confiscated the homes of Jewish families living in the area that had once belonged to the kingdom of Judea and sold them to Gentiles. The proceeds from the sale of homes and land went to Roman speculators and not to the former Jewish owners. In cases where a home had been destroyed in a series of wars against Rome after the Great Rebellion, the land was sold off in the same manner. The Jewish families were forced to pack whatever they could carry and find somewhere else in the Roman Empire to live among other Jews or to create a Jewish community from scratch. Pre-existing Jewish communities expanded in the eastern Mediterranean, in the city of Alexandria, the city of Antioch, the city of Damascus, and in the capital of the empire, Rome. While some Jews settled in Greece and in a few more cities on the Italian peninsula, like Naples and Capua, most remained in the eastern Mediterranean, along the shores of Asia Minor, or in areas north and south of Palestine, including the Nile Delta in Egypt. The most problematic aspect of the diaspora was that Jews were now forced to live among Gentiles, who had very different religious laws and customs, many of which conflicted with the Mosaic Law. Living in a larger community with different ways of life, as well as Gentile political, social, and cultural institutions, made it problematic for maintaining a Jewish identity. The threat of total assimilation became a constant danger for a people that prided itself in obeying their God's laws, which gave them a Jewish identity as a people set apart as the chosen people. Relations between the Jews and the Romans depended on both the emperor's stance toward them, but also, and more frequently, on the local Roman officials where Jews happened to live. Some emperors honored the pact that the Roman Senate had made with Herod the Great, allowing Jews to live according to their religious beliefs. Others forced all people living in the empire to worship them as gods and refused to exclude Jews from participating in the imperial cult. Sometimes Jews faced expulsion from their new homes, as was the case with several Roman communities during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, or found their local synagogue closed by order of Roman officials owing to some perceived transgression. The last Jewish war and the final expulsion of Jews from the Promised Land began in 132 CE. Emperor Hadrian provoked the rebellion by announcing his intention to transform Jerusalem into a Roman city dedicated to Roman gods. He marked out the Temple Mount, the area where the Second Temple once stood, for special attention. He declared that he would erect 4 temples, one to Jupiter, the chief Roman god and the god of the Roman state, another to Juno, his wife and the goddess and protector of Rome, a third to Minerva, the Roman goddess of war and the goddess of arts, crafts, and professions of the citizens of Rome, and one to the imperial cult for the worship of him, Hadrian, as a living god. The erection of the Roman temples on the Temple Mount was nothing less than the complete Romanization of Judea. The building project on the Temple Mount replicated the Capitoline Hill. This hill was located in Rome and glorified the state and its deities. Romans believed that sacrifices made on the sacred hill were more pleasing to the 3 gods than sacrifices made elsewhere. Hadrian abolished the name of Jerusalem for the city, designating it with a new Roman name, Aelia Capitolina, based on Hadrian's surname Aelius, and Capitolina, the Latin name for the Capitoline Hill. He then renamed Herod the Great's kingdom Palestine. As far as the Romans were concerned, the kingdom of Judea was Romanized once and for all. In this drawing of the former Temple Mount in Aelia Capitolina, which is based on historical sources, we see how Hadrian rebuilt the Temple Mount to serve the religious and political needs of Rome. The arrow in the upper right-hand part of the drawing points to the Wailing Wall. It originally was a retaining wall for the Temple Mount that had been built to support the weight of Herod's renovation of the temple. The Romans kept the retaining wall to prevent the hill from collapsing. It thus became the only part of the temple complex left standing after the Romans obliterated the temple. To remind Jews of what their rebellion had cost them, future Roman emperors allowed Jews to return to Aelia Capitolina once a year, on the anniversary of the temple's destruction, to mourn the loss of their temple in Jerusalem. Jews often cried out in sorrow to their God, whom they believed had punished them for their sins, hence the name the Wailing Wall. The Wailing Wall still exists today and is still considered a sacred place for Jews. The diaspora and the Romanization of Judea, which included the obliteration of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple had great historical significance. It was arguably the greatest threat the Jewish people had faced up to that point in human history. Jews were no longer a single community, but rather many communities spread across 3 continents. Jerusalem no longer existed, and although the Jews did not consider the city to be divine, they did consider it a sacred place. It was where they believed the God of Abraham had chosen for its seat on earth. It was in the temple, and only in the temple, that their God allowed them to make animal sacrifices. It was only in the temple where the God of Abraham manifested its presence to the Jewish people in a special way. What had the Romans done? Clearly, Hadrian intended for the new city, the transformation of the Temple Mount, and the new name Palestine to erase the former kingdom of Judea and Jerusalem forever as the focal point of Jewish political, cultural, and social life. But he also attempted something even more far-reaching. Although Emperor Hadrian did not clearly articulate it as such, he tried to accomplish nothing less than the cultural genocide of the Jews. For how could the Jewish people retain their identity without any social, cultural, political, or economic institutions to ensure their unique way of life? How could they pass down knowledge to future generations exactly as it was supposedly given to them by the God of Abraham? These questions, of course, are rhetorical, that is, intended for reflection, because there is no easy answer. So, let me end the podcast with one question that you should be able to answer. Should we consider the Romans anti-Semitic? Go back to your notes to our previous podcast if you do not remember the core elements of our definition, or how we determined whether or not we have encountered a historical case of anti-Semitism. Be prepared to prove your conclusion with historical evidence.